Hello everyone and welcome to... This is Africa, and here in the south is South Africa. Now let's dash through its story, shall we? The many millennia of human residence in scenic, sweeping southern Africa began with ancient peoples sheltering themselves in caves such as this, which doesn't really look very comfortable, does it? But sleeping on rock is a bit better than being breakfast for wild animals, and so it isn't surprising that hunting was the main occupation of the first known inhabitants, the San. These hunter-gatherers had no collective name for themselves, and San was the title given to them, somewhat snobbishly, by the next arrivals, the Khoikhoi, nomadic keepers of livestock. They called the hunters San because that meant people without cattle. Both groups were compelled to move over for the next arrivals, however, which were tribes speaking Bantu languages from West Central Africa, metal workers, who, over a long period of time, expanded throughout and conquered much of the continent. In South Africa, they would develop into peoples such as the Xhosa and the Zulu. Kingdoms were formed, but information is scarce, as there were no systems of writing to make records. In the year 1488, the Portuguese sailed across the Cape of Good Hope in search of establishing trade with the East. As the British and Dutch began to rise in naval power in the 1600s, the Cape of Good Hope proved an ideal rest stop on the long voyage to Asia, and in 1652, the Dutch navigator Jan van Riebeeck founded a settlement there that would come to be known as Cape Town, probably because it was a town on the Cape. Dutch settlers, along with their slaves, set up a thriving agricultural colony, elbowing the Khoikhoi away for better terrain. The mixed descendants of Asian slaves with Africans or Europeans produced the Cape-coloured ethnic group. As for the Dutch farmers, they became known as Boeren, which is Dutch for farmers. We say Boers in English, but I don't want to bore you with any more linguistic stuff. Basically, many Boers became upset with the way the Dutch East India Company was running the Cape Colony, i.e. caring more for making money than caring for the people making it for them. So Boers began venturing further out into the country to make their own way and not be bound by rankling regulations. The Boers who entered the Eastern Cape region came into conflict with the Xhosa. Then the British came to town. Why? Well, mainly to protect their seafaring route to India. They were prompted towards this course of action after France occupied the Netherlands in 1795. Concerned that France might mess with their maritime monetary matters, Britain began sticking its beak into the Cape Colony and pecking about, and after pecking some more, decided to just take over, which it did officially in 1814. The English language spread. British settlers began arriving, sheep farming expanded, and so did the desire for more land. Like the Dutch before them, the British began fighting the Xhosa, and the turbulence only escalated in what's known as the Mfukane, a time of great upheaval. In the midst of this mayhem stands the figure of Shaka Zulu. He rose to power in 1816 and revamped the Zulu people's military into a formidable force, conquering neighbouring tribes and strengthening his kingdom in a series of campaigns that devastated and severely depopulated the area. He was assassinated by his own half-brothers in 1828. Meanwhile, the Boers were growing dissatisfied with the British administration, which was making massive changes, not only abolishing slavery, but changing every facet of traditional Boer life. The upshot was the Great Trek, where thousands of Boers ventured deep into the interior of southern Africa to carve out self-governing republics for themselves. It was an undertaking beset with hardship, peril, and massacres by the Zulu. Even so, the Boers conquered sizable swathes of land. The 1860s saw the mineral revolution, where mining boomed after gold and diamonds were discovered, and as a result of this, more land was sought by the British, so they stomped out to get some. The Anglo-Zulu War followed. Britain's initial invasion was repulsed after a Zulu army with 10 times as many troops defeated them, so the British returned with a larger force and crushed the Zulu and took the land. But historically, land is a lot like gold. The more you get, the more you want. Britain wanted more. Remember how the Boers had moved far away to avoid the British? Well, they weren't far away enough anymore. Britain had been gobbling up more and more ground and hungrily eyed the Boer republics, and the tension simmered hotter into a boil, and it was war. The First Boer War's outcome embarrassed the British, who were completely outclassed and thrashed by the Boers. And then, a few years later, the biggest gold field in the world was discovered in the Boer Transvaal state. Masses of people, including many British, began flocking there to dig up riches. Thus was born, very rapidly, the city of Johannesburg. Then the tensions recurred. The many thousands of British workers there were paying taxes, but were not allowed to vote. The president and the Boer population did not want them to have a vote, because they had a hunch the British would vote in Britishness, and thus deprive the Boers of power. The two sides decided to settle their differences in an ostrich race. No, of course not. It was war again. The Second Boer War saw the British, this time, summon troops from around its empire, and while the Boers fought hard and well, Britain's Lord Kitchener and his mustache cooked up a ruthless scorched earth policy to crush them, burning farms and tossing Boer women and children into concentration camps, in which many thousands died. After the relentless British push, the Boers finally surrendered and the war was over. In 1910 we observed the Union of South Africa, the joining of the southern African colonies under British rule. In 1913's Native Land Act, native Africans were restricted from acquiring lands outside of designated reserves. After the price of gold declined, black miners were favoured by employers as their wages were smaller, causing white miners to strike, causing Prime Minister Jan Smuts to smash the strikers with thousands of troops and aircraft attacks. In 1934, South Africa gained independence from the United Kingdom, and in 1948 introduced apartheid. What did that mean? The government bundled the population into 4 categories: white, black, coloured and Indian, and enforced a system of segregation to keep the groups separated. Needless to say, the non-white groups were unhappy about the limitations placed upon them in everyday life and employment. In 1951, the African National Congress, or ANC, launched its defiance campaign, protesting the apartheid system. Let's have a quick look at some clips of life in 1950s South Africa.
This is also a land of over 12 million people. About 3 million of these are white people of European origin, but more than 9 million are people of dark-skinned races. And the story of South Africa is largely their story. As is the custom, in the early morning, Ngana and his sons will take care of the cattle, the most valued possession of a native family and the measure of its wealth. Outside her hut, Ngana's wife and her children are breakfasting on corn porridge called mealies. The family's possessions are meager but highly prized. Young men seeking a start in life leave the reserves for a few months or years to work under contract in other parts of South Africa. The native farm families have been provided with many features of European life, and their standard of living is much higher than in the native reserves. In many ways, however, the natives are restricted. None can leave the farm without a pass from his employer, but still no one is bound to the land. If a family dislikes life on one farm, it may move on to another. Mining of gold, diamonds, and other minerals is the basis for prosperity in South Africa. It makes city life very different from that on the reserves and farms. Management and technical supervision of the mines is by Europeans. But the labor is performed by natives who've contracted to work for the mining company. Many of these natives have come directly from the reserves. According to law, no native can leave company property without permission. Europeans of South Africa live in much the same way as people do in modern communities everywhere. A vigorous community spirit is reflected in the fine schools, the many beautiful churches, handsome apartment buildings, and the attractive stores well stocked with the latest type of goods. The Union has a representative form of government, though white citizens enjoy far greater representation than do the dark-skinned people. It is a land where light and dark-skinned races work side by side to build a secure and prosperous way of life. South Africa is one of our good neighbors in the world family of nations.
In 1966, the United Nations declared apartheid to be a crime against humanity, and in 1974, South Africa's UN membership was suspended. The country was also banned from competing at the Olympics. Even so, South Africa's economy thrived. A South African doctor performed the world's first heart transplant, but resistance to apartheid had been growing stronger after the Sharpeville massacre, in which 69 black protesters were killed by police. This was the event that spurred ANC member Nelson Mandela to, reluctantly, choose violence as the means to tackle the government. He was soon arrested and imprisoned on Robben Island. There was also anger about the border war, in which South African-administered Namibia sought independence, and the rage skyrocketed after the Soweto uprising, in which thousands of protesting black school students were fired on by police, who killed 176, though some say more. South Africa became more and more internationally isolated, and began hurting from sanctions and lack of foreign investment. Finally, F.W. de Klerk came to power in 1989, and made it his mission to dismantle apartheid. He freed Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison, who was elected president in 1994 in the country's first election in which people of all ethnicities could vote. Mandela made de Klerk deputy president and commissioned the activist bishop Desmond Tutu to head the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to listen to, adjudicate and grant amnesty towards those entangled in the troubles of the apartheid era. Yet the post-apartheid era was also fraught with troubles: the HIV epidemic, massive unemployment and soaring crime, including one of the world's highest homicide rates, and politicians gleefully singing "Kill the Boer." Tutu's vision of a rainbow nation of harmony and unity is evidently unrealized. But despite all this, South Africa retains a high level of human development, with the third largest and most technologically advanced economy in Africa, a complex, fascinating nation of tremendous natural beauty that has given the world extraordinary accomplishments in multiple fields, ranging from literature to sport to science. But what awaits South Africa in the years ahead? Comment below, but for now, bye-bye!